Welcome to the 2025 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. Please read our anti-harassment policy in the chat box, and don't forget to subscribe to our Latinx and Kidlit Book Festival's YouTube channel for more educational resources. We're going to begin tonight with some brief introductions. I'll begin. My name is Emma Otheguy. I'm the author of many books for children, including the early reader series Reina Ramos, the picture books Martí's Song for Freedom, A Sled for Gabo, and Martina Has Too Many Tias. All of those books are also available in Spanish. And most recently, my book Cousins in the Time of Magic was just published this year. And it is also published, I'm very excited to show you, in Spanish. This is a time travel fantasy about the Civil War and Cinco de Mayo for kids ages 8 to 12. Jose, can you introduce yourself to us?
Hi, good evening. I'm Jose Pablo Iriarte. My debut novel came out in 2024, and it's Benny Ramirez and the Nearly Departed. And the follow-up book came out just this last June, and it's AJ Torres and the Treasure of Captain Grayshark. I am incredibly jealous of you that your books are out in Spanish as well. That is fantastic. I've also got a lot of short stories out there in various magazines, but right now it's all about the books.
Wonderful. Pablo.
My name is Pablo Leon. I am originally from Guatemala. I'm an author, director, animator, just illustrator, a little bit of everything. My debut is called Silence Voices. It's a YA that talks about the historical event of the Guatemalan Civil War. That is out today, actually. So, you guys can check it out. And I was also the illustrator for, thank you. It's also the illustrator for Miles Morales, Shockwaves, for Scholastic, Marvel, and yeah, I'm just happy to be here. My books are unfortunately not in Spanish yet, but I hope so one day.
Publishers, everybody wants them, so I hope publishers are listening. It's wonderful to meet you both. I'm glad that we're all here together to talk about Latinx history and culture tonight. So let's start with our first question, our first topic of discussion. How do you see your books and Latinx culture integrated into the classroom curriculum? Can you share any effective methods to bring our culture to life year-round, not only during Hispanic Heritage Month, that you can share with us? And Pablo, why don't we start with you this time?
So I'm assuming it's not a lot of books about history or culture in Latin America in the classroom, unfortunately. I do know that from personal experience that librarians are constantly pushing these books, and I appreciate that they're doing that work, especially with graphic novels, which a lot of people have mixed feelings about. In my opinion, that they tend to be a really good gateway into several of these topics, really hard topics. I can't say that it's always worked, but what I've basically done is that for most of my personal work, which usually rolls around history or documented history, particularly of Central America, like I essentially just push that every time, just unknowingly push that everywhere to maybe to some degrees that may not be, super healthy. But what usually happens though in these spaces is either for books or for film, is that most people aren't aware of anything that's of the topics, but it piques their interest enough to look it up on their own. So that's what's worked.
Yeah, wonderful. And what about you, Jose?
I think when you're trying to integrate into the curriculum that you've already got, I think it's worthwhile to think about what are all of the different threads that are running through a particular book. So you could be talking about the Guatemalan Civil War. Then if that's a topic that you want to touch on, or you want to touch about, larger Latin American issues, then you can bring this in. My book, for instance, in addition to the a story that's about, you know, a kid meeting the ghost of his grandfather and trying to help him with his problems and, you know, hijinks and all that. It's got a lot of other stuff going on. It's got a lot about Cuban American music and Cuban music of the last century or so. It's got a lot about Miami and South Florida. So if you were teaching in Florida, where we sometimes have units on Florida history or Florida geography, you could incorporate all of its exploration of Miami. And for one thing I'm very proud of is it's not the stereotypical South Beach Art Deco and palm trees Miami. It's a more nuanced view of Miami because I grew up there. But if you wanted to talk about music, we could be talking about merengue and cha-cha-cha and salsa and all that stuff. If you wanted to be talking about food, then I can, you know, you could tie the book into that. So I would look at the elements that are besides the plot, and then that makes the plot itself kind of a fun add-on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you brought up Miami. I also, I did not grow up in Miami, but I have a lot of family there. And Cousins in the Time of Magic starts in Miami. The kids travel back in time, but it starts with cousins together in their tia's house in Miami and all of the culture and I would say chaos of that city and how it pulls them into the history. And I also love what you shared about building on existing knowledge. So this spring, I was able to visit several schools that had taught Cousins in the Time of Magic and see firsthand what teachers were doing with it and what was working really well. This is a book about the real history of Cinco de Mayo and the United States Civil War. So there are lots of opportunities, especially for middle school teachers, to build upon what kids are already learning about the Civil War, but even for younger kids as well. They're still coming in with some knowledge of, you know, they at least know who Abraham Lincoln is. They usually know that the Civil War is a war between the states. They know it is the war in which slavery was abolished. They don't necessarily know that there were any Latinos or any dimension of international history to this conflict. So the best thing I saw a library do, this was so above and beyond, is I saw a library build a giant paper replica of the Constitution balloon. We have a photo of it here. Yeah, this is an amazing library that I visited that just went above and beyond. But I'll talk to you about this balloon. This Constitution balloon was a real hydrogen balloon that was flown by the Union Army during the Civil War. And one of the officers who used this balloon for reconnaissance was a Cuban American. Does anybody know that? Is anybody ever taught that there were Latino Union officers? No. But it's so important, right? It connects us right to this history. It makes every kid feel like they have a stake in this history. And when this librarian did this with the students, it was so cute. They made also different props to make a photo booth. So they even had a little telegraph transmitter with like a little paper tap that you could tap. This type of activity just brings students so much, it gives them such a strong sense of ownership. Another thing that this librarian and also another fifth grade teacher I visited did was to actually read the entirety of the book aloud in a reader's theater format. Cousins in the Time of Magic has big historical concepts, but it's actually a really short book. If you look at it, it's very, very thin spine. It's less than 200 pages. It's illustrated throughout the book. So teachers were actually able to read aloud the entire book. And that really helped kids get into the book. And the reader's theater format really made them feel identified with it. And that, I think, was the most important piece of what that activity did for kids, because it made the kids feel a connection and a stake in the text. And at the end of the day, for me, the most important takeaway is that the history of America is not, we don't have two separate histories, right? We don't have Latin American history and United States history. We have one history that is connected. And so it's everyone's history. It matters because it's the history of America. And so when teachers do these activities, creating an art project where they take over the library with a concept from the book, reading aloud the book, having kids act as characters from the book, it gives kids these deep connections that I hope will draw them into the history and make them remember the characters, ideally for the rest of their lives. Our next question, jumping in, is how can we make connections to the real world? How are we viewed in society? And how are we reacting to our current political climate in our books? And Pablo, do you want to jump in first this time?
Yeah. well, not to shy away from the from talking about the very real horrors that we've lived and are living through, is probably the best way to make this connection. I mean, for a lot of obvious reasons, I think we aren't exactly looking like things aren't exactly looking up for us lately in this country.
Yeah.
For but so again, solely speaking from that Central American point of view, I do feel that um, we have to be more upfront and have that awkward conversation about um, our very real connection to the United States in the way that it's created a lot of a lot of our problems in this political climate, and they kind of centered themselves into our affairs to some degree. I mean, for instance, we talk daily about the migrant problem, but who created this problem? Um, and it's an awkward conversation that no one really wants to hear that, but we have to start to be better about not just talking about the problem, but without bringing up who created the problem. So
Mhm.
I think that's kind of where we kind of have to connect those things to our culture, because yeah, we definitely need to start moving on from this culture of silence that we have, of saying that we have issues, but where did they come from? So we have to like also
Mhm.
pinpoint those things and just kind of be real with ourselves about that. I think.
Yeah. Jose.
I think this is definitely a time of just kind of unrivaled slander against all of our different peoples.
Mhm.
Um, I think one thing that's important is we need lots of stories, because we're all coming from a whole lot of different backgrounds. I'm thinking of Chimamanda Adichie's idea of
Mhm.
the single narrative, and we want to avoid that. So I come from a very privileged background as a Cuban American, and all of us on this panel are light skinned, and we have that kind of privilege as well. Um, and if we only tell my story, or if we only tell Pablo's story, um, then we're not giving the kids a complete kind of set of a foundation to deal from. So I think, because for instance, my story is really a story about cultural joy and familial love. Everybody in my protagonist family loves each other, and they're all trying to support each
Mm.
other, and they have their they bump heads here and there, they have their misunderstandings, but it's not a story about angst, and it's not a story about identity angst. I think that's valuable for Latina kids, and I think it's valuable for Anglo kids to see. It can be humanizing. It can say to kids who are not from, and this is another aspect. I live in Florida. When I go to schools and I present, a lot of times I'm presenting in areas where there are a lot of us, but there are other areas where there aren't. And I think that both kinds of presentations are valuable, and they have their place. I think it's valuable for Anglo kids to see my characters having their very Cuban experiences. For instance, the traditions that we have around New Year's Eve, for instance, and things like that, and to kind of say, oh, this is different from what I'm used to, and this is cool and interesting. It's also valuable for Latina kids to see themselves and say, look, my life belongs in books also, and belongs in art as well. Um, but stories about overcoming oppression, and stories about why do these problems exist. So I'm thinking, for instance, of Jenny Torres Sanchez's We Are Not From Here. Those stories need to be in the conversation also. And so if we just have kind of the
Mm.
one Latina book that gets thrown in front of kids, then no matter which book it is, and no matter what kind of story it is, we're going to have a very incomplete picture, and not do as much as we could to kind of weave together how vibrant all of our narratives are, again, both for the benefit of Latina kids and also for Anglo kids.
Yeah. I think as both of you have said, we're really seeing the results of our failures to cultivate open hearts, tolerance, respect for other people in the people who become our leaders.
And to teach history.
That is why, and to teach history. Yeah, absolutely. So, I think we are in an extremely difficult moment. I think that I have already seen the way our efforts are being hurt by, it matters when the President of the United States adopts a regressive America First agenda. It matters when the President of the United States issues executive orders limiting the way history is taught in school. All of that matters, and all of that has repercussions. What I always come back to is that is the truth of our history, which remains true regardless of the administration or its policies. And we know that there's no separating American history from Latino history. And what I tell kids when I visit them in schools is that traveling back in time in a magic boat, that is fiction. But everything else in my book is true. Latinos really did fight in the Civil War. Cinco de Mayo, this battle when the Mexicans defeated an invading French army that would have supported the Confederacy, that potentially could have invaded American territory. Cinco de Mayo mattered and had an impact on the Civil War, and that in turn has impacted everybody who is living in North America today. So to say these things that have been lately cast as political can feel political, but I am reminded that this is the truth of our history, and it's not political to say these things. It's accurate. So culture is at the heart of learning a language. How have you managed both the content, the language development, and the culture in your books? Can we start with Pablo?
So, when I came to the U.S. As a teen, what happened is people usually would ask me like, what was it like growing up in Guatemala? And like, most people really struggle to pinpoint where it is in the map. It's always like it's below Mexico. And I usually just respond with the usual like weird banter of like, oh, it's a beautiful country. We have a lot of great landscapes, a ton of volcanoes. We have so many volcanoes, and really great coffee. I'm really biased because I feel like Guatemalan tamales are the best of all. Again, super biased. But I also don't want to shy away from talking about the hard conversations. Is that we had a really bad war, and you can put this same situation with El Salvador and Nicaragua or Honduras, and so the indigenous people of my country in the country were the ones that were affected the most and are still affected most. So how I've come around to it is like it's not trying to say we only speak of the bad things, but kind of be open to talking about our history of conflict and how can we try to just acknowledge this and learn it so we don't repeat it for our future generations, which it's super easy to say, as the years kind of like gone through in this decade, it's really hard to replicate, to see in like the cyclical situations of every country. So, but that's kind of where I feel like that's where I kind of put a lot of my effort into kind of managing these topics, these conversations, kind of developing this language of like, let's talk about these problems so we can find some kind of room for hope in the future. That's kind of where I've landed.
What about you, Jose?
I would say that my two books that are out are really very intimate stories. and they're very strongly rooted in the protagonist families. And so where I approach culture in both of them is in those intimate celebrations, or just those intimate ways of relating, the things that are important, whether it's the food or the music or baseball, or the beach, or whatever else. When it comes to language, and I guess culture as well, I have had an advantage. I think we all have the same advantage, but I've had an advantage in that I have just drawn on my history. I have written things that are set in what I grew up in. I grew up in Miami as well. And so my characters code switch when I code switch, when I would naturally code switch. And my characters are interested in the things, or notice the things that kind of were a part of my life growing up. And that's how I've been able to kind of incorporate that. There's something worthwhile to be said for when my characters do code switch. First of all, I don't put the Spanish words in italics, and I don't directly translate it either, because they wouldn't, right? I don't know if any of you ever saw the TV show. This is a show kind of steeped in the Cuban American experience, and it's from the early 1980s, late 1970s, called Que Pasa USA. And if you've never seen that show, seek it out. It's an amazing, hilarious show, really all about just kind of that culture shock and culture clash, and 3 different generations of Cuban Americans kind of making their way in Miami. But I kind of took the same approach as far as like insider versus outsider as that show did. And that's the sense that if you're a fly in the wall, like maybe you're reading the book and you don't speak any Spanish, I think you're going to be able to follow along. First of all, there's not an overwhelming amount of Spanish in it. But you know what the conversation is, you know where the sources of conflict are, and you have enough context to be able to pick it up without me stopping the story to kind of spoon feed it. So that's how I've managed it. And I think for different projects, a different approach would work. But I've been lucky enough that I could just kind of ease into what's familiar to me.
Yeah. I love what you said about family and that really being the vehicle for talking about culture. That was very much true for me when writing Cousins in the Time of Magic. It's these 3 cousins and their zany aunt, Tia Sia. And that is what their family dynamics become the space in which culture is explored in these books. So there's this long tradition in Anglophone children's literature of having trios, right? We have Betsy, Tacy, and Tib. We have Harry, Ron, and Hermione. And it's always 3 friends that are the protagonists of these adventure stories. By putting my trio in the family context, I got to get into almost like another layer of language and cultural dynamics that I think we often as authors don't have the opportunity to explore. So one of the questions that I think can really be unique to Latino kids is, what language do you talk to your cousins in? Maybe some of them are native Spanish speakers or native bilinguals, some aren't. Even if you're all native bilinguals, do you talk to each other in English or in Spanish? And when does that change? And one moment that I loved writing is when one of the younger cousins is really experiencing a lot of homesickness and they're very worried, and the other cousin turns to them and says something in Spanish, even though they normally speak to each other in English, because that felt really true to how I would talk to my own cousins. And then the aunt was really important to me as a mechanism of subverting stereotypes. So in fantasy novels and historical novels, right, we have the trio, and then we often have some kind of wise sage guide. And it's typically a man, usually a white guy, and this person is very erudite and philosophical and sort of serious. And so I said, well, what if this highly educated, nerdy person who knows all about history and all about the secrets of magic is actually your Latina aunt with big hoops who likes to listen to Bad Bunny? And that became Tia Sia. That the question for me became, what if instead of, your stereotype for that wise professorial person in the fantasy novel, instead of it being Professor Diggory Kirk from the Chronicles of Narnia, what if it's Tia Sia? What does that tell us about what it means to be educated, what it means to be smart, what it means to be capable, what it means to be powerful. And so family, that was it for me.
I'm really glad you raised
Jose, you
that
wanted
point.
to
Yeah.
jump in on
Yeah.
bilingualism. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think that's kind of can be a fraught thing for some readers and for some Latina readers. Sometimes we have an off-putting tendency to treat kids or any Latinas who are not bilingual as maybe not fully belonging, and that's an important thing to counter. So that is something I tried to be conscious of. In Benny, Benny is pretty bilingual, but in AJ, you don't actually see AJ speak in Spanish, actually. People around him do, and he's in a situation where he understands what's being said to him, but doesn't have that comfort level to be able to speak in Spanish himself. And I thought it was important. It's something that I was deliberate about, because that's some of our kids. Some of our kids understand their parents and their grandparents, but are not fully bilingual themselves, but they belong and they're part of the culture also, and they need to see themselves represented. And they need to know that that's valid. And then other kids are more fully bilingual. So I'm glad you raised that.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of interesting language dynamics that our books
Mhm.
are able to get into. So we're going to see a definition now of intercultural competence, which is a concept that some of the educators wanted to talk about tonight. So intercultural competence is the ability to function effectively across cultures and to communicate and work with people from different cultural backgrounds. So how can intercultural competence be beneficial for our students?
So I've had a lot of times media specialists will say to me, "Oh, I've got a lot of Latina readers, and so that's why I want to bring you into our school." And I am very grateful for that, and I certainly don't want to gainsay that. But we have a lot of conversation about kids from marginalized backgrounds being able to see themselves. Well, what if you are at a school where you maybe don't happen to have a Latina kid in your charge? Does that mean that our books are irrelevant to you? And I would say that they're not. It's important for marginalized kids to see themselves as the stars of their story, but it's important for privileged kids to see marginalized kids as the stars of their stories. It's important to be able to read the story of a Guatemalan kid and say, I could feel everything in that. All of that made sense. I could see myself in that story. So I think it's important for us to see ourselves in our own stories, but it's important for us to see ourselves in each other's stories as well. And I would say that really we should be reading these books in all schools. Not mine specifically, although you're welcome to. But many stories, many backgrounds.
Yeah, I think
Hello.
also to echo what Jose saying as well, like I think not just not just the usual stories that we, which all of our stories are very important, but that we also have very different diverse groups within our communities. We have like the indigenous groups, Afro Latinos, Afro Latinas, and Ogarifunas, depending on where you are. And so it's just like that doesn't mean that we have to like, oh, if we don't see that, like we don't identify ourselves with that. That's more like kind of like just learning how to empathize with these stories as well. And the first step is like being able to see them first. So I think that's also like super valuable, kind of like what you brought up before, Jose, as well, like just being able to see them first. Like I think that's a first that's super important.
Yeah. When I talk to librarians or to teachers, one of the first questions that I like to start with is I start with a fact, which is that a quarter of kids in the United States are Latino. And then I say, if we went and looked at the books that are available to our students in public institutions, in their public schools, and in their public libraries, would we see 1 in 4 books representing a Latino experience? Would it be even close? And then the question becomes, given that we all know that it isn't, despite the strides we've made to try and make those numbers line up a little bit more, We know that we're still not achieving anything like a 1 in 4 number. We know that most kids are never going to read a book by or about a Latino from the time they start kindergarten to the time they graduate high school. So given that we know all of that, what are we teaching kids about Latinos? Because we're not teaching them nothing by not including these books, right? We're teaching them something. And we're saying something when we say that this is a quarter of our people, but not worthy of any representation in our public institutions. That sends a really powerful and I think dangerous message to kids about what is okay. I'm also going to read some numbers for all of us. These numbers are not totally up to date, but they were accurate as of at least a few years ago. I actually think they're accurate today. Tens of millions of people in the United States and 16% of school-age children speak Spanish. Spanish is the second most widely spoken language in the United States, and we have a larger number of Spanish speakers than most Latin American countries. So that means that every person in the United States, and particularly every kid who is growing up and is going to emerge into a world that is more Latin than the one we currently live in, lives in this world and has to interact. And these are going to be their neighbors, their friends, their partners, their employees, their bosses, the people who they share life with. And that for me is what intercultural competence is about, is really being able to interact with your countrymen. I'll use that phrase very intentionally in this context. So when speaking to readers, what are some challenges when teaching Latin culture?
I think, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think well, for me, it's more how how I present my work, and how much we can push the reader to as well. Like we're in a kind of a weird time where certain people have pushed this idea that empathy is bad. So getting a lot of this, why should I care what happens anywhere else? So kind of like building that thread of, okay, well, this is related to this, and this is why you should care about this, because so and so. But also, you don't want to overwhelm them with this like info dump, and that's kind of the where I've fallen to, because I think they'll just slowly turn off. So like we're very we've connected in that most readers are slightly aware of our history through their parents or their grandparents, but not enough to pinpoint the historical accuracy. So, for instance, like last year, I gave a lecture on Latin comics to a class at UCLA, and I mentioned Silent Voices at the time, and there was this guy who was like, my grandfather was he was a guerrilla, and he was part of the guerrilla, and he said things were bad, but I don't know anything else outside of it. So that's kind of where I see it, where they are kind of aware but not enough, and that's kind of just giving that little gateway into like them learning about this. So presenting this story that's like digestible to them, but still leave some room so they can look at it with more detail, documented sources as well in their own time.
Mm-hmm. Jose?
I think that it's worthwhile to draw a distinction between the work that we do as writers to be able to tell a story that is nuanced and rich, and the work that we do as writers to be entertaining. And so I think, to Pablo's point, if this should not feel like a pill that you're being made to swallow. This should not feel like a food that you eat that doesn't taste good, but it's good for you. I think we need to do everything we can to make sure that our own knowledge is thorough, and to make sure that our own attitudes are good and positive attitudes, that we're prepared to include not just ourselves, but that we're prepared to include all kinds of diversity, all kinds of intersectional diversity, and that our own knowledge of our history is accurate, and that that we've got all of those pieces in place. But then you stand back and you try to just tell a good story. And a good story, I'm not saying that it can't be about issues. A good story absolutely can. And again, I bring up We Are Not From Here. A good story can be a really exciting story of a fraught journey that only needed to be taken because of political reasons. Or, in the case of my books, they're just funny stories about stupid ghosts. But while you're reading the funny story, maybe you're laughing at some of their antics, you're also getting an insight into a life either that is your own, or maybe a life that isn't your own. So I think I don't want to minimize it to say, I don't want to boil it down to only tell an entertaining story. I think we have to do our homework first, but then you have to be entertaining.
Right. Yeah, I think we never want to isolate students by trying to highlight a specific group, because we're concerned about the risk of sending kids a message that this book isn't for you. And of course, we're doing that because we're trying to correct a situation where Latino students are not included in the books that are available. But we also want to always focus on that idea that Latino history is for everybody. It matters to everybody. And Pablo, you brought up graphic novels early in this conversation, and of course I've been talking about them throughout. And I wanted to come back to that because my book is illustrated, and it's not a graphic novel. It's very much a traditional novel, but it's illustrated throughout. And that was really important to me because of the way it draws kids in. And one of the ways I have seen at, I think, pretty much every school I've presented this book to, there is always one kid. I always read this chapter where the cousins are fleeing an ironclad. This is, I don't know if anybody can see that. So this is an ironclad. It's a Confederate ironclad. The cousins are trying to get away from it in their little magic sailboat. It's an exciting scene to read aloud. And every time I get to this scene, there is some kid in the back of the assembly who has been giving me that face like, I am deathly bored and you are killing me. Kids are never bored during my assembly. I shouldn't say that. But, there's that one kid who really doesn't want to be there. And then I read this chapter and they see this image and they go, an ironclad. And if you're wondering, wait, why do all these kids in all of the random towns that I have visited to talk about my book know about ironclads, which is, a very random 19th century technology, it's because they've read Nathan Hale's Big Bad Ironclad, the graphic novel. And there is always some kid in that assembly who has read that graphic novel a dozen times and can tell me what each one of those smokestacks and, ties on the side of the boat does in excruciating detail. And that's what pulls them in. And I want all of those readers. I want the readers who feel like, oh, I love fantasy, I love history, I love Latino issues, this is for me. And I want that reader who's like, I'm not interested in any of that, but weird 19th century technology that appears in another graphic novel that I already love, I'm all over. And I'm like, yes, Latin American history has so much more where that comes from. So that's my favorite thing. So finally, let's talk about culturally responsive practices or methods that you use when presenting your books.
So I have I want to say mixtape, but that just shows my age. I have a playlist of a lot of salsa merengue music going back to Gloria Estefan, of course, but going back to Celia Cruz and also Mark Anthony and all these people. And so when kids are walking into the room, if I am lucky enough to be in a situation where the kids are there, where I'm there before the kids are, then I always have that music playing, and that just kind of sets the tone of this is what we're going to be doing. And then the other thing that I try to do is I find that I'm at my best when I have anecdotes that I can relate to anything. And I'm also at my best when I can make fun of myself and give kids permission to laugh at me as well. So I'll talk about like the first time I am the cook in my family, and my father was the cook in my family growing up, but he didn't really necessarily want to teach me. His idea of teaching me was, hand me that spatula or whatever. So, talk about my own first attempts to cook and how I botched those and how that was funny, or singing karaoke and having something go wrong, or things like that. So I try to tell a lot of stories and show pictures of the elements of my life that kind of tie into the book. And if I can make those stories kind of funny as well, then I feel like that's a helpful thing.
Pablo?
For me, it's more about finding, and I think I've said it a couple of times, which is finding a way to talk about what is good and wholesome, but also the problems that we face, both here and in our home countries. The multi-generational scars that leave a lot of these conflicts, and just trying to find that one room for hope. And I really like this phrase that I've heard it a few times. I've never been able to pinpoint who said it, but it sums up a lot of my feelings about it. It's that justice has no passport and empathy has no borders. And so we can just try to understand our historical memory and try to become more empathetic and aware of the atrocities around the world. But yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely. Whenever possible, when I'm visiting a school, I try to get to know the community beforehand. And usually the easiest way to do that is to have a meal with the teacher or librarian who's coordinating the visit beforehand. I find that when I do that, I get to know what kind of literacy practices already exist in the school or in the classroom. What are the students studying? What do they know? And then I'm able to bring that into my presentation. But even when that opportunity to sit down and talk to the teacher beforehand doesn't present itself, it's a shorter visit, I'm in and out. I find that there are other ways that we can, that I can learn from students and find out more about who they are and what's going on in the limited time I have with them. So sometimes that's talking to the kids as they file in. Often as kids file into an auditorium, we'll ask them, what's your favorite book, or what's a book you're reading right now? And that right there tells me a lot about the students' literacy. Kids who are reading will tell you what they're reading. And that little bit of information often goes a long way. One thing I loved is that I once had a school where the parents brought me a traditional meal from their culture. And so I got to eat food that was new to me and sit down and have lunch with many of the parents in the community, those that were available to be there for that event. And it made it really celebratory and gave me this other dimension to connect with the community. So lots of great things really that schools have done to give me that chance to connect more deeply with their students. And the great thing is that the history of Latinos is so broad and so vast that there's always that hook, there's always that connection to meet the reader where they are and to draw them in. We have one more question from an educator in New York, Dr. Carla España. And the question is, which book, graphic novel, film, or music would you put in conversation with your book? What a great question. I love this one.
So I'll jump in. For me, the first two that come to mind are The Epic Fail of Arturo Zamora by Pablo Cartaya, book that really centers Miami and cooking. It's not, it doesn't have a speculative element, but it centers, two of the big three, I guess, elements that are in my book. Second one, I guess, that comes to mind for me is Sal and Gabby Break the Universe by Carlos Hernandez, which is kind of same kind of humor, hijinks, kind of silliness going on, and Love, Sugar, Magic, A Dash of Trouble, to again bring up the cooking element. A lot of other people have compared it to Coco. There are really obvious parallels. I'm not going to spoil either my book or the movie to point out the ways in which they're different, but a lot of people do see the music connection there. That's a big one.
It's been out for a while, though. You could spoil it.
But I want to spoil my book by saying, no, it doesn't have the same twist as Coco has.
I think for me, graphic novel wise or book wise, Displacement, which was about it was a Japanese internment graphic novel that came out a couple years ago. It plays with the story aspects of the present or future generation, and then kind of looking into the past and all that terrible stuff that people went through as they were placed in camps. There's a lot of similarities on that and the way that some of those story elements play. And then film wise, I think there's a movie that I feel like not a lot of people watch, but it's called La Llorona, but it's not La Llorona from the scary Warner Brothers one. There's another by a Guatemalan director. His name is Jairo Bustamante, and it was sold as this horror movie, but it's really not a horror movie. It's a political thriller movie that's just a little scary, but not a lot. And it deals exactly with the Guatemalan Genocide and kind of that search for justice, but in a more supernatural way, with the legend of La Llorona, and kind of there's a twist to it. So I think, kind of just putting those some elements of that together, like for instance in my book, where we kind of deal with a little bit of the fallout from we had a genocide trial a couple of years ago, and so that's kind of mirrored in the movie. I'm sorry, but yeah, I think that one is great. It's just heads up, if you're expecting a full horror movie, it's not, but it's still really entertaining.
It's amazing. Thanks for those recommendations. I have an agenda, and I am hoping that I'm glad Dr. Spagna asked this question, because I'm hoping that somewhere in our audience is an educator who can carry out this agenda or talk to another educator who can make this happen at their school, which is that at some point in the 7th grade, typically, but in different school districts at different times, kids usually read at least one novel about the US Civil War. Maybe they read a Dear America book about the Civil War, but most likely they're reading Across 5 Aprils. And I think that this year, instead of reading Across 5 Aprils, you should read Cousins in the Time of Magic, because it's shorter, it's more adventurous, it's illustrated. You're still going to learn about Civil War history and what life was like for kids living during the Civil War, which is why people like reading the books that they do as part of their Civil War study. Kids can read it in English or in Spanish. So I have an agenda to usurp Across 5 Aprils. So I'll say that that's the book I would want my book in conversation with, just because that's typically the only Civil War fiction that kids read during middle school. So I would want it put in conversation with that. And then I'm not even put in conversation. I just want you to read my book instead of that. What I do want my book put in conversation with, or to be read alongside, is that there have been some really great books about life for enslaved people and life on plantations in the middle of the 19th century, at the time that Cousins in the Time of Magic takes place. That there's a little bit of plantation history in Cousins in the Time of Magic, but it's very brief because the whole book is very, very short. And so the book Free Water, which was a Newbery winner recently and is an incredible book and just full of sensory richness and adventure and excitement for kids, and centers the experience of enslaved children. That's the book that I hope that you would read in addition to when you read Cousins in the Time of Magic instead of Across 5 Aprils. We have 2 questions in the chat. Can we bring those up? Question from Delia Ruiz. Hi, Delia. How do you think that your book adds to the conversation about Latinx experiences in Kidlit? I like that we have that accent there, because sometimes I will say, when I read this word, sometimes I will say Latine and sometimes I will say Latine. And I like that Delia clarified how she wanted it pronounced and how she spelled it. That's awesome. Who wants to start?
So a part of my book is about the generational fallout of sorts of this conflict, and which is the first, second generation children of this person, of the survivor of the conflict. And when I was doing the research for that part, I talked to a lot of children of migrants, and I think something that was really interesting that kept coming up was like sometimes they were aware of these stories through like small anecdotes, or sometimes that their parents would say something and they would just be like, "Oh, that's really weird." But I think that was really interesting was that the feelings of something being denied from them as of their roots was something that was brought up a lot, and I think that's a very valid and probably very common feeling, that you are aware of something is wrong but you don't know, and your parents or your grandparents are not telling you, so you kind of have to look it up on your own, but you don't know where to start. And it's one of those situations where I think a lot of kids may feel that they are in that spot, so, or if they've they can identify with that feeling and how maybe not solve it, but just make it a little better. I think that's where mine would fall.
It's possible that I'm misinterpreting the question, and if so, I apologize if I'm too off base on this. But it sounded to me that in asking about how it adds to the conversation in Kidlit, it sounds like the question is kind of meta, that we're really kind of talking about the conversations that those of us who put books in front of kids are having with each other. And so for me, it comes back down to that mono myth or that mono story. If you're a kid growing up in Florida, and especially if you're a kid growing up in South Florida, then you possibly encounter, when you do encounter Latina stories, you encounter more Cuban stories. But in other parts of the country, that's not the case. So I think no book can tell all of our stories, and it's important to kind of have that variety. So in other parts, and I notice it myself, like when I am online talking to people, they see my name and they assume a certain set of background experiences that are not really my background experiences. I am not, I was born in this country. I come from, I am a citizen, and other folks have had some struggles that I have not had to go through. And so that doesn't mean I think you should stop telling one kind of story and tell another kind. I think we need lots of stories. And so here is a story where we're not focused on legal or illegal or immigration. It's an example of one kind of a Latina life that exists in the United States, so that you see, hey, here are people just going to school and living in their town and honoring and celebrating their culture, and it's a different culture from the dominant culture, and it exists. And then you see other books that are more kind of about, well, even among Cubans, you can have stories of the refugee experience back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and beyond. Or we can have stories about the Puerto Rican experience. So where I see it as is just kind of, I think it underscores the importance of making sure that everybody sees that there are a lot of ways to be Latina, and that there are a lot of valid stories that we all have to tell.
Wonderful. So we are just about out of time. So to wrap up, can you share where we can all find you online?
Yeah. So I'm more active on Instagram, and you can. I'm gonna say it, but it sounds weird. I'm at artsy That's my handle, and that's kind of everywhere, but I'm more active on Instagram.
Right. What about you, Jose?
If you just want links to stuff, then my website, josepabloiriarte.com, is good. If you just want cute and funny, mostly cute and funny stuff and news about my books, then Instagram, where I'm, again, Jose Pablo Iriarte. If you want angry political diatribes and sarcasm, then look me up on Blue Sky, where I am Labyrinth Rat, and that's a whole different experience.
So I'm glad we're ending with this question because I have recently been on a fairly extended, since May, social media break. So specifically a meta break. So if you have sent me a direct message on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, please email me. I always tell people, if you know how to spell my name, which hopefully everybody attending here does because it's up on the screen, you can find me. So I'm emma.otheguy@gmail. I'm emmaotheguy.com. And the best place to follow my book news is through my newsletter. That's where I am updating consistently. That's where I form relationships with readers. So if you subscribe to my newsletter and you reply, it goes out once a month. I think it's worth your while to read. If you reply, I will write back. I write back to every single reply I get to any one of my newsletters. And you can find that subscription link by going to emmaotheguy.com and a box will pop up, or you can go to emmaotheguy.substack.com and you can subscribe there. So that's where I am still most active. Just trying to make a little bit more time for my readers and deep engagement with them, and a little bit less time scrolling instead of working on my books. Thanks so much. Thank you, Jose, and thank you, Pablo. It's been wonderful talking with both of you. And we'll end there. Thank you for attending the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. Adios.
Thank you, Emma, for doing double duty. And
Yeah, thank you.
The NCTE Annual Convention is the premier annual event for English language arts and literacy educators.
I can just go to NCTE and I know that the resources that I'm going to get there, the contacts that I'm going to make there, are people that are like-minded and people that I can trust.
NCTE, every year, every time I participate in the conference in general or any webinars, the community of people in the network always brings a refreshed spirit to me.
And I left last year's conference being like, this has solidified my decision. I know I want to be an English teacher. I'd always thought that that was maybe what I wanted to do, but I left the conference and I was like, absolutely, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life.
Because I realized that when you interact with teachers that teach in different states, you learn different approaches to teaching and learning because every state does things differently. And that's been a huge eye-opener for me.
Don't miss this chance to join fellow English language arts teachers and educators at the NCTE Annual Convention in Denver, Colorado.